Hey, hi everyone. Good morning, good evening. So we'll wait for 2 more minutes for people to join, then we'll start. Hope I'm audible. So I hope my screen is visible there. So my name is Karthik. Let me give a quick intro about myself. I have a little over 8 years of experience in IT industry. Right. Currently, I'm working with a company called Freshworks. It is a B2B SaaS startup, and we recently went IPO. Right, I'm working primarily as a backend developer, primarily with the APIs. Right. I started my career as a test engineer in manual testing, and later on moved to automation with Selenium and Java mainly. And I learned API in the process and automated many things in UI and API across different projects and platforms. And previously, I was with IBM and in CTS, and I came as a tester only in Freshworks. Right. And in Freshworks, I got the opportunity to move into development as a backend developer Java. So since I'm also more interested in APIs, web services, and more interested in looking in the backend end of the things in creating web applications, right? So after that, my knowledge about this APIs got even more enriched, and how it is actually working in the background, and what is happening if you trigger an API request, and all those things that are happening in the server. So I have a passion about solving data structures and algorithm problems, in code designing, system designs for large-scale distributed systems, and I also have a passion about like training people, part-time teaching, freelancing, and all those things. So I'm part of a way to automation as a part of a trainer for this web services API testing. That is a quick summary about myself. So I also wanted to know the pulse of my audience, right, before we enter the session. As this weekend, like day 1 and day 2, today and tomorrow is going to be a demo sessions, right? And if you're okay, we'll have continuous sessions in the upcoming weeks. So before commencing, I just want to know the pulse of my audience, right? So how many of you here are freshers or experienced or working as what profile? You can like, you don't have to unmute and talk in the Zoom. You can actually post your things in the chat window. Just help me to understand to better delivery. So you can say how much years of experience you are, your fresher or experience, if experience, how much years, like, and what domain you are currently in. Is it testing only, or you are in some other domain looking for testing, all those things? For only one response. I hope will be little more interactive. Yes. Okay. Great. 7 years, 2 years. And fresher so far. Okay. Selenium 3 years. Great. 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 So see, when I started out, as I said, like I started as a manual engineer. Later, I first learned Selenium UI automation kind of end, right? Because at the time I felt like it was a market buzzword. But what actually what we are all trying to achieve is like data integrity, right? For example, I am actually expecting on something to load in a web application in the right manner, right? And it has to have a content that is in a expected manner, right? Whatever I intend for the content to be in that way, it has to be displayed in the UI. See, UI mainly depends upon the API, right? So we'll see one by one in detail. So what UI does is like it takes the data from somewhere, let it be a server or a database, and it displays by putting those data into a right component, be it a text field or a date picker or a left nav or whatever. Right? Nowadays, most of the web applications that we are currently working, you might be only, I think, only one person so far posted that he's a fresher, right? So experienced people, obviously, you would have worked on multiple projects where content, I mean, a customer facing application or like internal applications or whatever, it is designed for a specific purpose, right? And that purpose mainly involves getting a data or posting some data to and fro from the server. But what is actually happening in the UI, we might not know, right? So let us start with that. So I just wanted to like you can actually post your answers in the chat and make this session a little interactive. So what I wanted to understand from you people is like, what's your idea of an API? What is actually an API? No, not a full form, of course. API we all know, application programming interface. But what does an API do in your perspective? Any answers? What do we call a particular thing as an API, and what does it exactly do? Built-in functions to interact with the browser. Maybe other way to put is like functions that are built to interact with the browsers. Yes, that may be called as an API. Communicate with two applications. Yes, that may be also called as an API. Yes, right. Any other answers? Yes, service consumed by application. Yes. See, all the answers are actually correct. So let's say there's a Java, let's say there's a programming language like Java, and with that, there is a library. Let's assume one library. I think many of you worked in Selenium, right? Obviously, to build a framework or to work in any data-driven application, you must have worked with this library called Apache POI or heard about that at least. It is a library which is used to read and write the data to and fro from the Excel, right? Right. So can we call this as an API? Can we call this as an API? Yes, right. So on a general terms, what is an API? API is something which is going to take a data and is going to process the data that is intended to do a specific purpose, right? In this example, what is the specific purpose of the Apache POI, which is going to read or write the data from the Excel, right? If you want to read the data, we wanted to specify what kind of data or what sheet we wanted to read. That will give us an input. It will process and give us an output, right? If you want to write some data into an Excel, obviously we'll send the data to this Apache PY library, classes and methods, and that method will in turn take care of writing the data to an Excel, right? So on a general terms, API is something which is going to process the data, processing maybe like putting data somewhere or getting the data back for you, right? And it's going to handle all these things for one specific purpose, right? In this example, the specific purpose is reading and writing data into an Excel, right? And now coming to a like a web application point of view. Like this is an obviously so only we call as a Java libraries. Apache previous owns such Java library. It's a Java library is what Java library is a packaged jar file, right? Jar file which has Java classes and Java methods to process certain things, right? Obviously, how we write Java code, we'll have a class. In the class, we'll have a methods and the fields. Method is going to take an argument and process the data that we are giving, and it's going to do something over the data, right? So it's a Java library, right? So any library that is going to be intended for a specific purpose can be called as an API, right? So this is in this particular context. And now coming to web application, what we can call as an API. So what particular entity that we can call as an API that is going to do a similar process to the one that we have discussed in this example? Any answers? So in general web application, what we will do? So let's say, so I always start with this example, right? Let's say a simple example of going to a google.com, right? So what happens here? Let's inspect. How many of you, I think many of the experienced people probably have explored this Chrome developer tools, I hope, right? This elements tab is used to display the elements of the web page, right? HTML DOM structure. So we'll come to the other tabs. I'm particularly interested currently in this tab called network tab, right? What this network tab does actually, it records the API that is triggered so that the particular web page is loaded, right? When I hit google.com, generally what happens? What sequence of action happens so that a Google web page is loaded for me? Request is sent before even a request. Yes, request is obviously sent. But where that request goes actually? Request is resolved by its IP address, right? IP address may be resolved in your local browser cache, in your internet service provider, in the main DNS servers where the domain or the thing is hosted. So obviously google.com or .co.in will be having an IP address associated with it, right? Not only one IP address, since Google is a huge consuming web page, right? Many people go to Google web page, right? It might have 2-3 IP addresses from where this web page will be served for us, right? So when I hit google.com, if you can see, one request is triggered, right? You see, this is a get request that is triggered with a request URL, and this URL will be resolved to an IP address in the DNS servers, and the DNS servers to know which server to go and fetch the data from, and everything happens via HTTP call. Now we have to understand. Now you can see the protocol here, right? Protocol here is HTTPS. So HTTP secure protocols. S stands for secure, right? We are having an encryption, SSL encryption from the browser to the server, so that the data is not read by the intermediary, anyone who is trying to access this request, right? Now we have to understand this HTTP or HTTPS is not only one type of the request that can be done via a browser. There are other types of requests that can be triggered via browser. We'll see other things little later. But most typical common form of communication protocol is HTTP or HTTPS, right? Now it will be resolved to a DNS server IP address. That IP address knows which server to go and fetch this information from, and it returns the response, right? Now Google homepage is loaded, right? This is the Google homepage, right? But who is giving this? Web page for me? You see the preview. It's actually a web page, right? It's HTML page, right? So who is giving the response back for us? If you see the content type or response type is HTML, right? The HTML page itself is returned for us. Yes, someone has answered, I guess. Server gives the response, right? It's HTML page. But server should somehow know to read the request, right? Okay, let's not go to that deep. So what I'm trying to ask is like, Server, let's assume the server is somehow able to read this request and it knows, oh, hey, I wanted to return a Google homepage, right? So can we call that as an API? I've received only one yes. So any news? Yes, right? So we can call this as an API. In a web application context, what is called an API? Any system or any server now which is going to accept this request, that is HTTP request. I mean, to be again put into a context, HTTP is not only one type of the request that is existing in the internet. It is also one of the requests, right? Let's go with the HTTP request for now. It is going to read the request, HTTP request like this, understand what is being requested, and respond back with the data. Now, what is this data in this context? It's a Google homepage. So that is called as an API. So now we are talking server, right? And so we understood what is an API in web application context. Some piece of let's say server which is going to read and process the request and return the data. Now we all talk about server and all those things. I wanted to understand from you people again, what do you mean by server actually? Because at least when I started my career, I had this confusion. What is the server? Or is it any special kind of thing that is doing some particular special job or what? So any answers from you people? Yes, the work of the server is to process the request whenever asked to do, but in a very real term, in a very physical term, what is a server actually? So can I say server is just a plain old computer which is sitting somewhere in another part of the world? Can I call like that? It is just a computer, right? It is just a computer which is sitting in another part of our country, another part of the world, which is having this special softwares. We'll come to what are those softwares or libraries running on that computer. Yes, right. Running on the computer, which is capable of reading a request and returning the right data. Right. So essentially, a server is just a computer with a RAM, CPU, and hard disk, right? And with a software loaded into it, which is designed to read the request from the client and return the data back to the client. Right? Someone says store business data. Technically, yes, but on the real terms, no. Server usually, at least in modern days nowadays, server doesn't store the data by itself. Right? Let's say you're having one software. Let's say you're running on college, right? And as a college admin, I wanted to have a software to maintain the information of the students, right? And I'm designing a web application wherein I hit some abccollege.com, right? And I can search for any student name and it will give me the student detail like his or first name, last name, email ID or address or whatever, right? So let's say we have a web application for that, right? And see, this data of a student should be stored somewhere, right? This first name, last name or email should be stored somewhere so that the server is able to take this data from that particular area and give it back to the requester, right? So typically, where are the data stored? Any answers? Resources. What are those resources actually? I want to understand. Someone has answered. It's stored in a database actually, right? So it is the data that is actually returned to the client is actually stored in the database. Database can be anything. It can be a binary file storage system like your hard drives. Yes, but we are not going to manage. A server is a machine that is not going to store any data on its computer. Okay. Generally, data is stored in a different computer. Server's work is to take the data from the different computer and get it back to us. But data can be stored in a plain direct raw format, right? It has to be processed somehow. So generally, we go with a SQL-based database storage, right, to store all these relational data like student details that just now we have discussed about, right? Those kind of SQL data are called relational data. We'll come to why it's a relational data and all those things. So let's say we have a MySQL installed in one computer. MySQL is one of a distribution of SQL-based database. I hope you are aware of that. It's very famous, actually, open source and famous. If you want an enterprise edition, obviously you can purchase that also, managed edition. So let's say we have a MySQL, like a SQL kind of a database that is installed. Let's say this is a software that is installed in one of the machine computer called computer DB. The name of this computer is computer DB, right? This particular machine has this MySQL installed and all the details of the students, right? Whereas our server computer is called form server. So these are two different computers, right? So now when you request a data, to which computer the request comes? To this COM server or this computer DB? Yes, COM server, right? And COM server work is it is responsible for getting the data from the computer DB and returning back to the client, right? So we'll come to this in a detail in a bit, right? So all the requests will not directly go to a database and fetch the data for you. It will come to a server, which is having this library or a software to handle all your requests. And that software is responsible for fetching the data from you. Another computer, which is where MySQL or any kind of database is installed. And from there, you have to, that server is responsible for getting the data out and returning back to the requester. Right? Okay. So someone says, please pardon, you have any questions, Pooja? Can we continue? Okay. Now, so we understood the server in a very generic terms, right? Server is responsible for reading the request and getting the data back to you. So COM server is actually a server computer. That's why we call it a COM server. Just a name I have given for this computer for a differentiation purpose. Right. Now we understood that is server in a very generic term. Let's try to understand what is a client in a very generic term. What is a client? Any answer? So why I'm stressing all these things is like before jumping into an API and understanding this API in a very what to say, very vague terms like Postman or API request, but I want you to understand what is actually happening in the back end when an API request is triggered. So yes, so we have to. It's important for us to understand all these terminologies, right? So client, yes, someone has answered browser. Okay. Client is a machine which requests data. I think that is more appropriate. See, browser client, yes, it is. It is also one of the client. But my question is browser the only client available throughout the world? Browser is one of the clients. It's correct answer. But client can be other than browser. Client can be anything other than the browser? Yes. If so, what are the other examples? Can we call it a client? Any other examples? Browser, obviously, we can call Chrome as a client or Firefox. Yes, we can call these as a client. Okay. Any other examples of what is a client? Local host. Local host is your local computer. Yes, technically you can call it as a client, but I want a very specific terms. Front end elements, not necessarily. Okay. See, we all use our mobile phones, right? Android, iOS, or whatever. We have applications installed, let's say Facebook app or WhatsApp or YouTube or whatever that is installed in your phone, right? Can we call those applications as a client? Yes, right? Why we can call those as a client? Any answers? Yes, obviously that particular app is responsible for, let's say if you are opening YouTube, that is responsible for loading your videos according to your preferences, right? So it is actually sending an API request to your Google servers to retrieve the videos back from the YouTube to your application, right? So it is client. So let's say mobile apps can be called as a client. So my next question is, can Postman be called as a client? How many says yes? How many says no? Yes, of course, right? Postman is also what work it is doing. It's responsible for sending your request and displaying it in another tool, right? Okay, next question. Can a Java library be called as a client? Let us say we are going to see it in the course of this upcoming 8 weeks. This also, right? Rest assured is a Java code which is going to, which can trigger an API request and automate your APIs, right? Can this rest assured, which is a Java code or Java library, can be called as a client? Yes, right? So anything that is requesting the data to a server can be called as a client. Not necessarily be an UI, right? UI we have because the data that is responded back from the server has to be presented in a nice and user readable format, right? Right. Say coming back to this Google example, see this Google server will return you a HTML page only, right? If you see the response also, it's a HTML, right? This HTML code is only returned to the client, right? Client in this example is a browser. But what this client is doing or this browser is doing, it is converting this HTML, or in other terms, rendering this HTML so that we as a user can display, see this web page nicely in a proper structure and order, and we are giving it as a functionality, right? But on a very plain and raw terms, it's just an HTML code, right? You're getting my point. So it is always a client's responsibility of putting your data or rendering your data in a very neat and tidy format so that the user interaction is very much nice. Otherwise, the client, the raw data is only responded, got as a response from the server, right? Raw data in this example is HTML content. Raw data in a very raw, typical API can be an XML or JSON formats, right? Getting the overall picture. So the client is something which sends the request and it is expecting some response, and server's job is to get the request, read the request, process the request, and return the response. Right? Now, this is an example of where I'm requesting the server for some data. In this example, I'm requesting the server for a Google homepage, right? But can I also create some data in the database through the client? Can I do that? Yes. Right. So this client server communication is not only to get the data from the server by requesting it from the client. Client can also post some data to the server so that the server gets the data from the client and save it to a database. Right? It's a kind of two-way communication, right? One such typical example is, let's say you are registering for, let's say you're a new user to Facebook or whatever. Obviously, you have to sign up to the particular portal, right? During sign up, you will give your email ID, you will set up your password, and maybe it will ask some security questions. It will ask you to verify your email by going to your email and clicking on that link. So through all these actions, what you are doing, you are actually sending some data back to the client. Let's say you are typing some username and password during the sign up. So what it will do, it will convert your username and password as a password encrypted data, and it will store somewhere in the database, right or not? So in that example, what your client and server is doing is actually taking the data from the client and sending it to server. And in that example, what is the work of the server? Work of the server is to get the data, process the data, and put it into a database, right? Right or not? So what is the work of a server? What is its first work? If client requests data, then get data for it. It's the first work, right? What's the second work? Client posts some data to database, process the data, and store it in DB or whatever it wanted to do, right? Now we are talking about the process, right? What do you mean by process? What actually, see, we are sending the data to server to store it into a database, but why it has to process the data in the first place? Right? Or in another terms, I'll put the question like this. Instead of sending the data to a client, why can't we connect a database directly from the, instead of sending the data to the server, right? Through the browser or Postman or whatever, through API, why can't we connect a database directly from the browser and directly save or get the data from the database? Why it is not a good idea? Any answers? Let's say in this browser, right? Can I write any code, or why people didn't think of writing any code so that this browser itself directly connect to a database and get the data directly? Why not? Yes, I think someone has answered. One of the very important aspect of not doing that is security, right? If Facebook allows its database to be directly connected via client, then through the client interaction, obviously you can see what are the database columns and all those things. You can directly access the database, you can modify and do whatever you want, right? It's a security threat. So it is not a viable option. Now, what is the second reason? This is a first and foremost important reason. Connecting a database directly from a client is a very, very bad idea, because you have full access to everything. Security breach, you can control. Facebook is not going to control the database after that. You are going to control everything from that point, right? Which is not a good idea. Okay? Now, what is the second reason behind doing that? The second reason is where this processing comes. Why we have to process the data to store it into a database or get the data from the database? Yes, to validate the data, right, before sending it to DB or processing it or whatever, right? So validation of data is very, very important. See, what if I am some hacker and I'm trying to send a SQL code? I know some SQL database is used in this web application. I'm just sending you some SQL code for it to execute in the database, right? Let's say there's a SQL code called delete from start, right? Let's say you are filling some online forms, online application, and you are notorious of trying to break the system. And let's say you are just in one of the field in the form, you're just typing this, right? Delete from start. What if we didn't process the data coming from the browser and directly save it into a database? There is a chance of this data executing into the SQL directly, right? That happens, what happens? Every data from the database will be deleted, right? Your code will be executed in the database, okay? Which we don't want, right? I'm just giving you a very broad example. In very specific terms, we call it as a SQL injection. So there is some process called sanity of data. Sanitizing the data will happen, right? We have to actually get the data and read the data to understand whether this data is in the right format or right structure without any harmful queries like this, right? And then only send the data to a database. Otherwise, this kind of threats will occur, right? And the second answer is someone has answered, yes, business logic. So in every time, you don't have to actually give the data, whatever you get the client. Okay, let's say this field is a number field, right? Okay, this is a number, not a SQL query. Directly save it to database. No, right? There are some business logics that are applied to it. Let's say you are filling some form which requires your mobile number. Okay, there's a mobile number field in your UI. In India, mobile number is 10 digits, right? So let's say by mistake, someone has typed some 11 digits or random digits like this, right? So is it right for us to directly save this data into a database without validating this data in first place? So our business logic says what? Hey, if the data is coming from India, it has to be of 10 digits with the proper country code, right? Then save it to database for the further processing, right? So if there are, I'm just giving a very vague business example. Obviously, in your projects, you might encounter so many business scenarios like this, complex business logics where you wanted to do so many operations and manipulations over the data which you wanted to process, right? It's just a very simple example of why data validation is required in the server, right? If you ask me, yes, client can do this data validation in UI itself, in the browser itself. If a person types more than 10 digits, you can show a warning. Hey, type only 10 digits, yes. But how many things you can handle in the UI, right? For that only server is there, right? So it is a work of a server to carry the bulk of the load of validating the data that is coming from the client, right? This part is called data validation. And for that also, this server is as a middleman is very important before your data enters into a database. Right? Now we saw the getting of the data from the database. We saw like putting some data into a database using client, right? Getting data from the database in a HTTP terms, we call it as a GET request, right? Whereas putting a data into a database can be achieved through post or put request, right? So what is this? Again, what is this again? This put or patch request. Right? So if there is a certain data which is already there in the database, right, which I wanted to edit and do some changes over the data. Let's say, coming back to a student example, if there are any email IDs for the student, and if there are any error in the first name, last name, email ID, I just wanted to correct back in the UI and send it back to a database. If you want to correct some data that is present in the data, we can make use of this put and patch HTTP request, right? That is also possible. So getting data is possible, putting a new data is possible, updating an existing data is possible. And finally, what is left of the major CRUD operation? Delete, right? So if you want to delete any data from the database, that is also possible, right? Let's say if a student is no longer enrolled in our system, if you want to remove the data from our database, we can go ahead and remove the data through the API. So these four operations, apart from this, there are so many operations that you can do via API, but these are the four main operations that initially we wanted to learn, right? And this we call as a CRUD operation: create, read, update, and delete, right? These are the four main API operations that we wanted to know. Okay. So far so good. Now, we all talk about how this server connects to a database and get the data, put the data, delete the data from the database, or modify the data to a database. Now we saw one such server, right? Let's say in SQL terms, MySQL is there. So what are the other SQL database you might know? Any answers? SQL kind of database. Postgre, yes. Oracle. MongoDB is not a SQL database. We'll come back to that. Cassandra nodes, again, not a SQL database. Snowflake, I don't agree with SQL database. Okay, so what are the NoSQL database? Yes, this MongoDB, Cassandra, right? Snowflake. All this comes under Elasticsearch. There's a database called Elasticsearch. Right? All this comes under a NoSQL database. So what's the difference between this SQL and NoSQL database? SQL database stores the data, or at least displays the data in the form of tabular format, where we have relational data. When I say relational data, one column will have the relation with the another column of the another table. We call it primary and foreign key relationship, right? So let's say in the SQL kind of environment, coming back to the student example. Let's say we have a table name called student with columns ID, name, email, address, etc. as we discussed before. And let's say we have another table called student details. Okay. In this, we'll have an ID, and the student detail section will let's say what class that he or she is studying, and let's say rank of the student, and let's say subjects that he or she is enrolled to. These are the other details of student, right? But I'm keeping this data in a separate table called student details. But I'm joining this table with this, mapping this data to the student student table with this another column called student ID. The student ID will refer to the ID column of the student table, right? This is a typical MySQL kind of database, right? Why it's called a relational database? Because I'm forming a relation between this particular column here in this table to the column that is present in the student table, right? So data which are relational to one another. So if you ask me why can't we put these columns in the same table, yes, we can put, but there might be the possibility of duplication of rows. For example, let's say if a particular student is enrolled in 2-3 subjects, maths, physics, chemistry, and all, you have to put 3 entries for the same student here, right? But whereas maths, physics, chemistry will be an individual entry here, student ID you can obviously match with an individual entry in the student details table, right? So this particular concept of separating this data so that you reduce the duplication of the data is called normalization. So only in a SQL kind of database, we have this first normal form, second normal form, third normal form. I hope the experienced people have heard of this or worked on that. Beyond's normal form. Heard of this, anyone? So normalization is nothing but how we can split this existing data and split across multiple tables by forming a relation between one table to another table, and thereby achieving the deduplication of the data. Right? Or is it completely new? Is it not new? Okay. I mean, the scope of this API is to not learn of normalization, but it is always good to know, right? If you want to learn normalization, I think you can Google it. W3 schools are very good. I mean, very good information about this normalization and all like this. You can go out and read it. Okay. So, but why SQL kind of database came into first picture is, before nowadays only the application, the internet is worldwide in the last 20 years. Even before 20 years to say, internet is not that much. Last 15 years also, internet is becoming kind of boom worldwide. Everyone is having access to internet. So, but imagine the situation before 40-50 years where the internet is very rare commodity and only very special kind of sectors use. So one such sector which made use of this internet is banking kind of application, at least in the US, right? So that in those days, storage used to be very, very costly, right? If you wanted to purchase few MBs of data, you are going to spend some few dollars, maybe $50, $100. That much costly it was. Now, few terabytes of data itself is available for a very cheap price, right? So since I hope how many of you remember like floppy disk here? Anyone have used a floppy disk? I have used a floppy disk. I have a very nice memories of it. 1.44 MB, and if you buy a very big size one, it will be 2.88 MB. So the memory used to be very, very costly commodity in those days before the advent of SSD or flash drives. CD itself is not used nowadays. Even kind of pen drives and hard disk is kind of going away because the cloud storage is okay. So because of since the data was very, very costly, we cannot afford to have a duplicate data, thereby increasing the memory size and all those things. So the SQL data was very, very essential to normalize the data and store it in a very efficient way. And also that volumes of data in those days were not that much high. So SQL was not a problem. But now with the advent of internet and everyone having access to internet and different applications, we are all using Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, everything is owned by Meta now. That's a different story. I'm just saying Twitter and all those things. But how all these details are stored? Daily trillions of terabytes of data are consumed or produced in the internet. MySQL can handle all this data or what? Yes or no? Can MySQL handle trillions of data in a day? Yes or no? Actually, MySQL cannot handle all this data. Right? So only the concept of NoSQL database came into picture. Right? Let's take an example of MongoDB. How the MongoDB stores the data? In what format? They call it a document format, right? To put it into a simpler perspective, we can call it as a JSON format. So a database is actually capable of holding a certain data in a JSON format, actually, right? And this particular set of data or a particular element of unit of data, we call it as a document. So only it's called a document format database, right? And this data is not going to be stored in one place, even and it can be stored in multiple places, so that even if one place is too much occupied or the server is down, this data can be accessed from the secondary data storage and it can be given back to the user, right? So we call this aspect of having multiple database and having the code duplication and handling the huge volume of data, horizontal scaling, right? Why we need to read about this? You may wonder why API these things are coming, right? Because as a backend developer, I'm realizing if people have this knowledge about what is actually happening in the backend, API is nothing. It is if it is just some request which is traveling to the internet, right, and getting the response back to you. That is not important, but what actually happens in the backdrop is very, very important. Because at the end of the day, in the API response, we are going to validate certain data by triggering API request. But for validating the data is right or not, we have to understand how the data is processed in the background and where it is stored, and is the storing format right or not, and what are the other edge cases we might miss if we give a different set of data as an input, right? For knowing all these things, knowing what is happening in the background is very, very important, right? Agree with me? So see, MongoDB is one such database. My favorite database is, I think someone has said, it's Cassandra. Cassandra, I'm not going to go deep into that, but it's a wide column database. very interesting concept. Maybe if time is there, we can explore this later. One of my favorite database, actually, it's developed in Facebook, and it's made as open source. Okay. Now, my question is, can data be stored in? I was talking about this kind of databases installed in another separate computer, and the main server is responsible for connecting to that server and taking the data from these databases, right? But can data be stored only in the other servers where these kind of databases installed? Can the database not stored in the same computer as a server? Is it possible? Yes, it is possible, but it is not advisable. Why? It's possible, but it's not advisable. Why? Yes, overload. Yes, that's one of the main reason. Another reason is if something goes down and your entire database goes down, you should always have a separation of concern, right? Server, if server goes down, what if another server is active? That is, you cannot fetch the database because this server is down. If you put the data into a database server where the server code is residing, overload, yes, performance, yes, and also if one goes down, another should not go down. Okay, this is called availability. There is there is this theorem called CAP theorem. How many of you heard about this theorem? I don't know. Main concept of NoSQL database is based on this CAP theorem: consistency, availability, and partitioning. Okay, I will not go deep into that. Okay, so my question is, yes, data can be stored in the server, but you don't have to necessarily install a MySQL or any NoSQL kind of database into the server machine. Data can be stored in some other different form temporarily in a server machine itself. So these those type of data is an in-memory data. What's the difference between a data stored in memory and data stored in a database? What is an in-memory data? What is an in-memory data? Currently, no. Temporary storage, yes. But what is the temporary storage? Cache, yes, yes. So what is this in memory? What is this memory we are referring to? Why this is called as it's RAM, yes, right? So any data that is stored in RAM is temporary, right? If you restart the server, it will go. If you change any content in the RAM, the previous data will go, right? It's not a permanent storage, it's a temporary storage. But when the server is running, some data can be stored in the RAM of the same computer, so that there's some advantage to it. Will come. We'll see what's that advantage, right? So that the data is taken from the RAM. I mean, obviously, memory is a very limited resource, right? We cannot go ahead and use all the memory that you want. Let's say my computer is having 8 GB of RAM, right? Can I use all the 8 GB to store this data temporarily? No, right? There are some RAM that is required to run this server. There are some RAM for other computer processes, input output process. Everything is handled temporarily in the RAM, right? Applications are loaded in the RAM, right? So I cannot go ahead and make use of all the data that is available in the RAM. But yes, temporarily we can store some data in the RAM, right? Using some caching libraries or caching mechanism that is available, and the data can be accessed from the RAM also. But what is one other major advantage of taking the data from an in-memory database like RAM? Very big advantage. Fast, yes. So RAM is extremely fast to read and write data. So only, and it's also like if I'm in a MySQL database, let's say if the database is capable of handling some 10,000 requests per second. If the data is stored in RAM, it is capable of handling some 50,000 requests per second, right? It's very, very fast, especially with the advent of recent RAM technologies like DDR4, DDR5. So RAM is extremely fast, right? That is one of the very important reason. So because of that, making use of all these advantages of RAM, open source people developed an extensive library which stores the data in the RAM itself. That database is called Redis. How many of you have heard of this? There are other like open source libraries like Redis. Redshift, no. Redshift is again different. It's an AWS based, Amazon based database. But there is a data store called Redis. If you're not aware, like please go and read about this. Right? This is a kind of a in-memory data store. Okay? Data that you put in Redis will be stored in the RAM. Right? So let's put in this perspective. There are SQL databases, there are NoSQL databases, there are also in-memory based databases. Data can be put or got from any one of these databases, then that is the work of the server. It's not like data is going to be stored in only MySQL or NoSQL or only in the memory. It can be in the combination of all these three things also. And in the real world application, it is going to be combination of all these three things. Okay. Now, my next question is, so data can be only gotten from database or what? Let's say I'm requesting some data from Google. Can it only be gotten from a database? Let's say I can request any data from here, right? So what Google does, it stores all the data I'm asking at its database. Is it storing like that? Let's say I'm requesting for Delhi weather, right? Is it storing some Delhi weather information in its database? Yes or no? No, right? So where this weather information is coming from? So I'm requesting weather of Delhi. It is showing me the result, but where this information is coming from? Yes. So it's actually, you can see this information is coming from this website called weather.com, right? So what Google does, but we are requesting this Delhi weather to Google. Okay? Now, obviously our request will go to Google servers, but what the Google server will do? Google servers or the computers which is present in the Google end will again trigger an API request to the weather.com servers. Right? Yes, someone has answered. API that is exposed by weather.com. Weather.com would have exposed some public APIs or some private APIs for Google to consume, right? And that data is got from the weather.com by Google, and Google in turn returns the same data back to us. Now, who is responsible for rendering this data in this presentable format? Again, Google, yes, Google's UI. Right? So now, where this data is gotten from, it's not gotten from any database, right? At least from the Google end, right? Obviously, weather.com might have some database to store all this information. But in the Google's perspective, where this data is got from, not from any database, but from another server itself, right? Right or not? Right. So data can be gotten from a database, or data can be got from another API itself, right? It's not only about database. So whenever you are triggering an API request, or whenever you're testing an API, we don't have to always assume the data is only coming from a database, right? Data can be coming from another third-party service totally, that our servers are getting and giving it back to you. Are we getting the overall picture here, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm becoming notorious. I'm just keep on hitting this Google weather, right? So if I keep on hitting, obviously it's going to return the same result for me within a matter of minutes. Nothing is going to change, right? But every time I hit this request, will Google go and every time hit the weather.com and get the data from weather.com and give it back to us? What is happening there? Any answers? Every time, yes, right? Something, someone has answered. Satabdi has answered. So it's go, if someone has designed the system like that, then that means a very bad design of the system, right? First time, maybe it will go to weather.com and get the data from weather.com and return it back to you. At the same time, to store it in the cache, Google servers cache. Cache maybe cache like Redis that we talked about. Right? So data from that cache only will be returned for us. Right? Now let's say suddenly some storm is hitting Delhi tomorrow, and Google has this information cached, right? But let's say the weather.com has updated this Delhi weather to some storm instead of like sunny or cloudy. It is suddenly saying storm, right? Now, but Google doesn't have this information currently because it will always return you cached information. Now, what should happen so that the updated information from weather.com should reach Google? What should happen there? So there is something called cache eviction policy. It doesn't keep fetch every time. If some certain event happens or this cache has expired based on certain things, then it will go and fetch, right? Let's say, okay, I'm not going to go deep on those things. Let's say some event will happen so that the weather.com server will let know the Google, hey, we have updated the information, you can clear the cache now and fetch new information from us. And all those processes are happening in the background. We don't, as a consumer of the Google services, we don't worry about anything. We just hit refresh and the updated data will come back to us. Right? Fine. So what we learned is data necessarily doesn't have to come from a database. It can come from a separate web service, which the Google calls on itself. Right. That's the next thing we wanted to learn, right, in respect to API. And now another question comes. Let's say I'm not the only person who is using Google, right? Let's say in India, let's put into perspective. Let's say on average, some 10 lakh people at any given point of time. I'm just putting a very rough example, right? On any given time, 10 lakh people uses Google services, right? So I'm having a server. We have talked, right? What's a server? Server is again a computer which is going to process this request and returns you back the response, right? But let's say 10 lakh people are using at any given point of time. Will all the 10 lakh requests will be processed for you by the same server or the same machine? What is actually happening there? What is happening there? Any answers? Yes. Someone has answered. Any other answers? Location-based servers, yes, right. But in one location, how many servers is possible? Mhm. Yes, actually, there'll be multiple servers, right? Multiple servers. I'm not talking about 5 servers, 10 servers. There'll be 10,000 servers, 20,000 servers, 10 lakh servers, depending upon your need, right? That will be there and throughout the world, different geographical locations. And there's, yeah, someone has answered load balancer. Yes, there's a tool called load balancer, and that load balancer is only first is going to receive your request, and it will know which server is currently busy and which server is currently free. So it will always redirect to the request which it thinks is appropriate and which is currently not that much busy, right? So it's not always only one server that is going to handle your request. There'll be tens and thousands of servers machines. That is for very huge companies like Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, Google, Amazon, or whatever, right? Very huge companies like this, there are going to be lakhs and lakhs of servers that's going to process your data. Okay. So if server is not one, and going to be lakhs and lakhs of machines, right? What about database? Can we have only one database installed in one computer? Is that going to scale for all these users? Is it possible? See, data centers is again, data center is not an area where you store only data in a database. Data center is a very generic term. Data center is where all the machines are there. The machines where your servers are installed, machines where your database is also installed. Okay? So database is not only installed in one machine, database is also installed in thousands of machines, right? To get your data to all the people that you wanted to give, right? Because data is very huge. All these big companies are facing this data integrity problems, right? Recent example is being Twitter itself, right? I hope you know that Elon Musk proposed to buy Twitter and is suddenly backing off. By saying what reason? Anyone knows the reason actually? By he's saying like there are so many bot accounts in that Twitter and he wants some real data for him to proceed with the GDN. I hope you are aware of that Twitter takeover by Elon Musk. I don't think he's actually intended to buy anything. I think he always he's a very eccentric person, always in the mood of making profits out of somewhere. Okay. So coming back to our API, so it's not only one server that is going to serve your data. Multiple servers. Again, it's not only one database that's going to handle your data. There are multiple data stores or machines that are going to handle your database, right? Let's say, okay, so this is how it happens, and it's there are so many things that are happening in the background. So you might ask the question, how a server will know which, let's say you are saying me, right? This database is installed in thousands of machines. How a server will know which machine this data is there to go and fetch exactly there, right? So many things that are happening, but only once very good term I can give it to you. It's very important if you want, if you're aspiring for product-based companies and all those things. Please read about this. There's some algorithm called consistent hashing algorithm, right? Many tech companies use this algorithm. It is already available in many open source libraries so that things are equal. Even load balancer uses this kind of algorithm, consistent hashing, so that load is distributed and also server knows which machine to connect so that it can take the data from that right machine, right? I hope, how many of you are aware of Java here or even new to Java, learning Java? How many of you are having a basic, right? You have, right? So in Java also, we use a kind of an hashing algorithm in this data structure called a hash map or hash set. And I interview so many people, right? And if it's an entry level fresher, this is the first question I will ask. So what's the hash map? I think most of you will know, right? The hash map is a key value pair. So key will be there, against that value will be there. But what is an internal working of hash map? I think many people were not able to answer. So any answers? How is an internal working of hash map or hash set? Any answers? Will not allow duplicate. Yes, again, that is how hash map works. But how it is implemented? How the duplicate is actually avoided? Duplicate is not in the key. Obviously, values can have duplicate values, right? How the key is not duplicated? So when you give a key to a hash map, it will create an hash for that key. The hash will always be constant for a given key. Let's say my key is a string, right? Let's say my key is an API and my value is today's date. Let's say today's date. My key is API batch and my value is 18 June, right? Now, if I compute hash for this key, right, always it will return a unique hash for me, consistent unique hash, right? Let's say the hash maybe 5x, I'm just giving a rough example, it can be anything. Let's say this is the hash computed for this input, right? How much time I give this input, only this hash will be generated for me. And this hash will be mapped to a particular memory location in RAM, right? So irrespective of how many times I give the same key, always same hash will be computed, and the same hash will be mapped to a memory location in RAM. Because of that, only key is not duplicated. So if I update the value, new entry will not be created in the hash map. This value will be replaced because the hash value computed by the hash function is always the same, right? I hope you are aware of hash map. But I'll give you another example of where that might be a problem. Let's say I'm having another key called batch of June. And let's say I'm putting a value here, some random value, June batch, something like this, I'm putting a value. So is there a possibility that for this key also same hash is constructed? Is there a possibility? Few people have answered no. What or any other answers? Actually, the answer is yes. There is a possibility. Okay, but the possibility is like 1 in maybe a million. But there is always this possibility of getting the same hash for two different keys, and this concept is called hash collision. I hope you have heard of this term called hash collision, right? Hash collision is nothing but we give a two different keys, same hash will be computed for the two different keys, right? Hash collisions happens, but happens very rarely. So for data that are very minimal, like let's say I wanted to put some 100 data, even 1,000 data, even 10,000 data, the probability of getting the hash collision is very, very minimum. But if I put some 10 lakh data, million data, 10 million data, there's a slight probability that I might get a hash collision. Right? So you have to be aware of all these things. Just a quick note about hashing and hash map. Okay. So there is always probability of hash collision. Okay. Please learn this concept. It's very, very useful actually. Even in terms of API, there are so many things that are happening in the background where this hashing functions used, hash map is used. Yes, keys duplicate means yes, only keys key placed. Yes. So because of that only hash collision is always a problem. If you find time, read about this called in Java. If you're interested in Java kind of thing, there's something called equals and hash code. Okay. Please read about this. Maybe if time permits, we'll see about this elaborately tomorrow. Very, very interesting to know actually these equals and hash. What is the equals and what is an hash code? So now we have a generic idea, right? How what is a client? What is the responsibility of a client? How it functions? And also what is how this API request travels, how it travels. It is resolved to an DNS IP address, and that IP address will be in the DNS servers of the particular DNS providers, right? And DNS providers know in which server and which location to go and access this data to, right? Okay. And we also know what is the generic work of server, right? Server work is to get the request, process the request, and get the data from the database, return it back to the client, right? And also we saw the 4 different types of API requests: get, put, post, delete, and all those things. Right? Now we'll come back to this logic. Same again, having this. So this is the area where this DOM structure of HTML structure is loaded. What is this console window? Any answers? Output. Okay, yes. You can see whatever is happening in the UI. If something is logged in the UI, you can see the output here. Yes, okay. What are the other uses? I can execute a full-fledged JavaScript code here. So JavaScript is specifically used for handling a browser type of database, right? So not database, browser type of tool, right? So JavaScript by default has certain methods that are specifically designed to access and manipulate and create a functionality for these DOM elements, right or not? What are the three key features of an web page? Web page will have an HTML, which will give you the structure of the web page. Structure in the sense like this, there's a search bar here, search bar should be in the top, and there are like different weather results as a list. Like this is a structure that is created using HTML, right? What is the second component of a web page? Not header, body. Is someone has answered? Yes, CSS. Styling, right? So see this particular search box is in this rounded shape in the edge because of some CSS properties, right? CSS gives the color, structure, and style of the particular HTML. It goes hand in hand along with HTML, right? And the jQuery and JavaScript. jQuery is actually a wrapper library around JavaScript, but mainly it's a JavaScript, right? And for information, people are moving away from jQuery nowadays. If you are not knowing, please know that. So people who thought jQuery was cool before 10 years is finding jQuery is too much overloaded. Why? Because after the advent of ES6 of JavaScript, I mean, other versions came very recently, but JavaScript, whatever jQuery was created primarily to like minimize the code of a JavaScript, right? But with advent of latest JavaScript that was having so many built-in libraries and functionalities, jQuery became very out of date. And also another important reason is jQuery is heavy, right? Whereas JavaScript is light-weighted compared to jQuery. Why we should not use a heavy-weighted application in the front end? Any answers? More coding, kind of, yes, but what that more coding means, what it leads to ultimately? More coding means more size, right? Yes, time to load. So nowadays there are so many protocols and or certain things that many companies maintain, especially big companies like FANG, right? So they have this time thing called time to load, right? So this parameter is very, very important for them. If there are any slight discrepancy in that parameter, how much time that the web page is taking to load, it will severely affect the customer experience and in turn their revenue. That much sensitive those data are. So for optimization and yes, fast loading and very easy processing, jQuery is kind of outdated now. Everyone uses JavaScript. But again, HTML gives structure, CSS gives style. What is the purpose of this JavaScript ultimately? What does this JavaScript actually do? Validation, maybe yes, but what is the main work of fetch data, perform actions? Everything is right, but ultimately we can put everything in a single thing called action. Yes. So if you want to give some action to your web page, right, functionality or your some logic, some kind of a thing to do for the web page, right? It's going to be executed by your JavaScript, right? HTML and CSS cannot do. HTML, I think by this time you would have known, right? HTML is not actually a programming language. Even CSS is not actually a programming language. Right? JavaScript is actually a proper programming language. So that only we need a JavaScript for our HTML and CSS, right? Now this console window is used to execute your JavaScript code on over this particular web page, right? So all these things are like having this kind of document object which is going to access your DOM, and you can perform some action over this document object. You can get child node. Node is something but nothing but the element here, right? Element of div span here. So you can just explore this, right? You can execute any JavaScript here. Right? And what are the sources? What is the sources tab? Any answers? Sources are the where your what will be loaded. All the static content will be loaded, right? See, for this Google page to load, yes, there are static content, generic terms. JavaScript is loaded from the separate file called .js files. JavaScript is nowadays nobody is writing inside the HTML itself. They're writing in a separate JS file, and the JS file will be loaded from somewhere. We'll talk about where it is loaded from and all, right? And this image you can see in the left corner, right? Where this image is loaded from, again, this images are static files, right? We open this images folder. You can do search icon, this graph, right? This Google logo. These are the images, right? So images are loaded as a separate entity, and this you can see all those in this sources tab. And these images are referenced from this HTML, right? What is the image location and all those things and all. And the image from that location is downloaded and is rendered in the web page back to you. Okay. So all these images and JavaScript files, even CSS can be stored in a separate file called .css or .css, right? All these kind of files are called static files. Why it's called static files? Because once a JavaScript is loaded, we don't have to go and change JavaScript, right? If JavaScript is created by the developers to create some functionality for the web page, once it's loaded, that's done, right? Same goes for styles, right? Styles and HTML also. We don't have to manipulate or reload this again and again. So that these data are coming from a special types of database or server called CDN. Heard of this term? CDN. So CDNs are called content delivery networks. Okay? So let's say we are all using Google. Okay, I'm requesting for Delhi, whether someone will ask for London, whether Mumbai, whether Chennai, whether Bangalore, whether someone will ask something, right? The data is different, but the structure and the style is the same, right or not? Right or not? The structure of how this weather is displayed is the same, and the style of the where this image is loaded, this thing, everything is the same, right? If you also go, I also go. So for every user, is it a right thing to get these styles and JavaScript code and all those things which are like static content every time from the server or from a database? Right? What it will do, it will create unnecessary overload to server, right? For all these content which are like anyways going to be constant, right? It's not a variable content, anyway it's going to be constant only, right? So for data which are constant, these are stored in a special type of database called CDNs. Okay. So CDNs have two main purposes, which is going to store the static content like this, and also store the content which are accessed by the users very frequently. Right. So let's say give another example of CDNs. So we have to think API in a very broad perspective. It's not only about we are getting this JSON response from a server, it's a get request, put post, and it's not only limited to that. It can be more than that also. Right? The API work is also to fetch data from the CDNs. Right? I always give this example of our Netflix. Do you know why Netflix is actually part of the FANG company? What are the FANGs nowadays? Mang actually, right? What is this Mang called? Answers. FANG or Mang, whatever you like to call it. Answers.
Big companies.
Yes. right?
Like Google, Amazon, Apple, Netflix,
Yes.
and Facebook. I think Amazon.
Yeah, it became Meta, right? Yes. So why this Netflix is part of this FANG companies? Netflix is such a huge, some people call it as a tech marvel also, because nobody at the time thought like a video streaming platform can scale for this many users, right? And it's also now currently very active in India, Netflix, right? Let's say you are watching a movie or content, right? Netflix has servers in Mumbai, okay? But let's say you are watching somewhere in the Northeast, and how many of you are fan of this TV series? One of my favorite. It's a recent last series, last part released, I guess. So let's say I'm watching some Peaky Blinders somewhere sitting in the Northeast, okay? But where this movie or where this TV series will be stored, that video, where it will be stored for? It will be stored in the servers in the Mumbai for it to be delivered to you. On the cloud, yes. Obviously, we are talking about all these servers, right? All these servers are cloud only now. Nowadays, like mainstream servers and hosting is kind of gone, right? With the advent of AWS, GCP, and all those. What is AWS actually? Okay, but yes, these are the cloud. Even I was talking about the servers that are sitting in the remote, right? That is also a cloud, right? A database which is sitting on the machine, which is sitting in the remote, that is also called as a cloud, right? But let's say Mumbai, I was talking about Netflix has this servers in Mumbai, maybe in Bangalore. But let's say I'm sitting somewhere in the north or northeast or totally south or west, right? But for all the people, this data has to be served, right? But is it a right way to store this video content only in the servers in Mumbai or Bangalore and expect it to be a person who is accessing from Assam or Meghalaya is going to get the same content from all the way from Mumbai? Right? Not possible, right? So what Netflix does is store all these data. Anyway, this TV series is going to be a static content, right? Static content in the sense no one is going to change or modify this data. There is no post request, there is no put request, there's no delete request, right? Only get request. People are going to only get this data from the Netflix servers, right or no? So where there is a get heavy application and put post and delete less application, right? People generally design these systems to store in CDNs. So whatever movies or TV series you're consuming from Netflix is not directly coming from the servers of Netflix. Is actually coming from the CDNs. Okay, let's say you are now logging into a Netflix and you are accessing this Peaky Blinders. That request will be processed by the server sitting in the Mumbai, and it will directly redirect back to your CDN. CDN is something. Let's say CDN is a kind of a server plus your storage, server plus storage, right? It will redirect the request back to that CDN. CDN you can imagine as a server plus storage kind of implementation. Now, what the CDN does is like, okay, it recognizes it as an authorized user, and it will know like he is requesting for this content, and the content is actually delivered to you after that point from the CDNs. And CDNs are always nearer to you, right? For example, if I'm sitting in Northeast, there might be on CDN in Assam. If I'm in Rajasthan, there might be some CDN in Jaipur. If I'm in like Punjab, there might be CDN near Delhi, right? Something, right? So always this content is delivered from the CDN. CDN is a server. CDN is a server, yes, plus server along with the storage associated with it, right? Okay. So the purpose of the CDN is to deliver the content to you fast and with the scalability in the sense like with how many people accessing this particular content at this particular area. For everything, it has to deliver the content correctly. For that also, it is a design. And also it is used to show the data duplication. For example, there might be multiple CDNs that will be holding this Peaky Blinders, and it will be access to you from the right CDN based on your location, right? All these things are taken care by your actual server and the CDN servers, right? So this is also an area where you can get the data from the database. Right? Right or not? Okay. So data can be got from a CDN, data can be got from a database, data can be got from another web services that is accessed by your server, right? Now, we saw all these implementations like how this APIs, everything works in the backdrop. But my final question is like, what's the purpose of this API? Ultimately, what we are going to do with all these things? Why we need to do an API testing in the first place? And purpose of all this API? Okay, purpose anyway. We saw why do we need to do an API testing in the first place? Don't we know that API request is triggered, response is got? When UI is not ready, yes, you can technically, in the process perspective, yes, you can. Any other answers?
Because sharing of data between the two parties or sharing of services between the two parties is working properly or not.
Yes.
So
yes,
to make sure that that is working fine or not. That's
yes, exactly. So the integrity of data is very, very important, right? Let's say two parties are communicating. What is the surety that right request is sent to the another party and right response is received from another party? As an API testing, what we should do? Our goal is to ensure that we receive the right data and at also at the right time, right? So only we have this even in the Chrome developer tools. If you see here, we have all this performance and memory and all those things, right? Even if you go to the network tab, if you reload it, you can see a small performance here also. In the time taken to load all these data, time is very, very sensitive, right? Let's say you're going to some shopping application or even Netflix as an example. If you hit some movie content, and what if keeps on loading for you? So it has to, and obviously you'll be as a consumer, you'll be frustrated and leave the Netflix platform itself, right? So speed is very, very important in API. How much time we are getting the data, and are we getting the right data or not? Are we getting the data in the right structure or the format or the order? All these things are important in an API, right? And that is what we are going to also test in an API. Data integrity, whether the two parties mutually agreed on a contract, whether the proper data is displayed or not, that this data that is coming is in from the right time frame or not. So everything we are going to fetch, and as a last resort, what we are going to do, and as a part of data integrity, we are also going to check whether the data that is coming from to us is actually a same kind of data which is actually present in the database also. That might or might not, depending upon the use case of your company, because some company insists to check the database also apart from the API testing. But I don't think that is necessary, because at the end of the day, API is some kind of abstraction layer between the client and the database, right? You don't have to check the database again for the data to be present for the same thing you have validated by an API. For the only APIs are already present in the first place, right? So for all these purposes, API testing is required. Okay? So and also I was talking about this example of Google. You see, I can copy this same example. Even if I go to the Postman and let's say I'm hitting this data here. So I'm going to get this HTML as a response, right? So what I will do is, I will come to this Postman tool later, but you can see this thing called curl here. Can you see? Okay, someone was asking like, what is an API testing? Again, okay, I'll repeat it again. See, again, see that we are seeing that there are so many web applications, right? Two parties are agreeing to actually communicate. Let's say you are in Google company, okay? You are a Google developer or Google tester, right? Now, let's say this weather widget is not developed yet. So as a Google developer, you let's say you are given a feature so that if anyone searching for weather information, you should get the request, hit this weather.com API and get the response back and give the response to the Google UI. Okay. As a backend developer, as an API tester, your role is to test that, right? Let's say this is a use case. So if we request weather information for any city, weather.com will have certain format of sending the information, right? So you cannot send any random information randomly, right? Let's say that format is a JSON format. JSON format like this. City. And let's see. And temperature. 32 C something. It has some certain format of sending the data, right? You cannot send data in any random format. Let's say that data is a JSON data, right? As a Google developer, you will get you will hit the servers of weather.com. You will get this response, right? But you have to know what is the response format, right? Better. So to be able to send this correct format to the client, right? So there you have to know there's some city called there's some key called city in this JSON. There's some key called temperature in this JSON, so that you can read this response through the code and return it back to the UI, right? Without knowing this information, the first time, how will you be able to process the data from weather.com? Getting my question? Or any other explanation is needed? So now as an API tester in Google, what you will do? I'll validate the integrity of this response, right? Whether there is something called some key called city or temperature is present in the response or not. Whether the city information and actual weather information is coming in this valid data or not. What if this is empty string? Some problem happens in the weather.com server and it is returning you maybe some bug in the weather.com and it is returning you the empty response, right? Now, if you hit Google and if you get an empty, let's say this 30 degrees Celsius is an empty response, you are getting zero, some empty response, how you will feel? It's not a proper. So that means what? The API is not properly tested, right? So this is where an API tester comes into picture. The data has to be in the right format, and first data and correct key and correct data has to come in the first place, right? That is where the role of an API tester is very, very needed. Yes. So we need to know the template of the response and its data. Yes. And the template is called API contract in very business terms. So it's a contract or agreement between two parties, a sender or a receiver, right? Sender agrees, says to receiver, hey, I'm sending you in this format, in this template. And receiver has to process this particular data in that particular template order only, right? This is called a contract. Right? So in these areas only API testing comes into picture. Thereby we are verifying the data integrity. By verifying this data is correct and values coming here in this API response correctly, then we are ensuring that irrespective of whether any small bug is present in the UI, there is no breakage in our backend system. There is only glitch in the front-end UI. We are ensuring that data integrity when two systems communicate with each other. Right? I hope it is fine. Now, again, since we talked about the few clients, right? Same data that you can get via your Postman also if you hit google.com, right? Except that browser is going to render that HTML back to your nice content to view. Whereas Postman doesn't have to do that job, it is going to render you the raw HTML data as a response, right? Now, there is this utility called curl. How many of you have heard this utility called curl CURL? Anyone heard of this? just like Java, yes, you can say. It is just a library, except that it is just a command line library. Command line utility or a tool to trigger your API request. This API request can be triggered in a terminal kind of environment or in a like Linux kind of environment, or even Windows, where if you open the command prompt where the curl is installed, it can be yes in command prompt. So what I'm going to do is just copy this curl here, copy button, this entire curl code will be copied. Right? If you go to the terminal window, and I hit enter and send the request, we are getting the response, right? This response is again what? It's an HTML response, right? HTML, right? So same data we are getting through your curl in the terminal. Same data we are getting in the Postman. Again, the same data we are getting in the UI, except that the rendering is different in the three different tools. So only we are calling all these tools as what? All these tools are called what? Any answers? All these tools can be called as client, right? Yes, client. So can I call this curl as a client? This piece of code as a client? Yes, obviously, right? So it is also able to send the request and get the data and display in a certain format. In the format maybe in which we don't like, but yes, it is displaying us in a certain format, right? This is also called as a client. Now there are many in-depth things to experience, right? So the goal of the today's demo session is to make you understand what is a client server architecture, and what is actually a client, what are the different types of client, how an API request is triggered, and how it is actually processed, and the server end, how it is processed, and how actually it's connected to a database, and where are the different processing happening, and from where and all we can get to different types of data like SQL, NoSQL, CDNs, or web services and API, and how the data is processed using data processing. Okay. So what's the load balancer? So this is if you are cut thorough in all these concepts, right? How this client server architecture is designed, how this communication is taking place. The rest part is very, very simple. We just have to understand the few terminologies in the API. And once that is understood, triggering an API, getting the response, validating. That's it. That is alone. Is the rest of the entire API process. And for that, for different use cases, different tools are there. For general use case, Chrome browser is there to get the data. Obviously, we cannot do everything in a browser, like triggering a post request or put request, testing out all these applications, all these responses. So for triggering other kind of data, we have this other kind of responses. See, if you in the Postman, you can do a post request, put, patch, delete, copy, get options. See, multiple things are there, right? You can do all these things in a Postman, manage your APIs here, right? That's the goal of the Postman. We'll see all these things in detail. And also, like if you wanted to automate entirely using Java and take the advantage of integrating in the entire Java ecosystem and libraries, obviously you can make use of the rest assured library as such. Okay. To do the same work, the work is what? Triggering an API request. As an API tester is what? Triggering an API request, get the response, validate the data, validate the response time, validate the response status, right? But that data is not only one type of data that you are going to trigger. You're going to request the data for multiple combinations, right? Let's say if it's a post request, you're going to put some small quantity of data and see how the server responds. That's called testing, right? Boundary value analysis, putting different values and testing how is the output, right? Putting some null values, putting some empty values and testing how is the output. So all these combinations we might want to try and see how is the response from the API. If for every positive and negative scenarios, if our API is able to handle correctly, then we call that API testing as success or failure, right? I don't know. So with this, we'll stop the today's session, right? We'll continue this tomorrow, and we'll go further in depth about this API request, all these, and what are the important and significance and components of an API, and what are its role in its authentication, authorization. We'll see everything in detail. So as far as we saw now, any questions until the things which we saw? Any questions? Course syllabus, we'll see tomorrow for the end of the second demo, right? But to give you a general idea, yes, we are going to see completely about everything about an API as a concept, as a hands-on, as a project, right? And also we are going to see everything about Postman as a tool and its what are collections, APIs, folders, that how we can trigger an API, we can validate the response, something called collection scripts where you can automate certain things, certain validations in the Postman, right? And we are also going to see about the rest assured framework, how we can create a trigger an API using rest assured. We are also going to integrate the Cucumber with rest assured and integrate BDD frameworks along with that, and create an automation framework. It's a API automation framework using the Java rest assured and Cucumber, like a data-driven framework, right? And also, right, yeah, this is the scope of a Newman as a tool, command line tool for triggering your Postman kind of API. And yeah, and the course is going to be for 8 weeks duration, 7 to 8 weeks, starting from this week. Okay. And yeah, yes, this is what's a microservice. See, microservice is nothing but there are two types of architecture in the back end that you might wanted to know, right? It's a monolith application, microservices application, right? So Netflix, I asked you a question, right? Why Netflix is in the fan? It's because the way they designed their system, right? Everything you cannot keep in every code you cannot keep in a single place and expect everything to happen in a single place, right? For example, if you're logging into Netflix, that authorization will take place in one server or one microservice. Microservice is nothing but a separate server intended to deliver only that kind of duty. There are servers which are responsible only to authorize you. There are servers that are responsible for only to give the video content to you, like CDNs. There are servers that are responsible for only to display the movies available, right? There are servers that are responsible only to handle your payment related things for Netflix, right? So the goal is to split the different functionalities and write different server code for different functionalities. So if you can split and integrate everything as a seamless user experience, that's called microservice. It's not some specially designed programming architectural scheme or something like that. We are just breaking down the problems into multiple pieces of code and implementing it in a different service. That's called microservice. And yes, authentication authorization will be covered as part of this syllabus. Yes. No, yes, by basic auth and every kind of authentication is kind of used. It's not like one authentication is better or the other. Depending upon your use case and the simplicity or complexity of what we are going to achieve through authentication, right? So basic authentication, token based, auth based, like cookie based or OAuth. So everything has its own use case. So everything is used. And yes, typically most of the web application APIs are authorized in one way or the other. To know, at least every application requires a login, right? How it is knowing that it is you or you are authorized to you do certain things. Yes, authentication is part of everywhere. Yes, we will cover everything. Yes. Say any other questions? Postman is not only for manual testing, we can automate to a certain degree using this certain thing called scripts. In the section will see all those things in the later point of time in this 8 weeks. Right? But yes, we can automate certain things in Postman. Any other questions? Again, Postman cannot do everything for you, right? Postman has certain limitations. It can do some basic sanity kind of automation or smoke test kind of automation. Whereas if you want full-fledged API automation, you have 1,000 use cases for functional testing of an API. How you can automate everything in the Postman? So for the test assured is required. And as a Java library, it can integrate well with every Java ecosystem. So you can make use of whatever library that you want to integrate with for automation frameworks. For that purpose, test assured is required. JavaScript is totally different from Java. We don't require that knowledge for doing an API testing. Many people confuse JavaScript with Java, right? It's totally different. JavaScript is a UI-based, client-based programming language mainly used in your browsers. Right? Java is a generic purpose programming language.
I have one question. So people, they say that they build their own framework for API. They use that term, building their framework. So is it that the framework can be built in more than one number of way based on one's interpretation, that they can build their own framework, or does it have a common template?
No. See, programming is a very generic implementation, right? Obviously, based on what you wanted to achieve in your project, you can build your framework in infinite ways. The possibilities are endless. There's no template for frameworks as such, but there are certain standards that you must follow.
Okay. Okay.
Standards are there, but there are no definitive answer for what is a framework, how it should be designed.
Okay.
It can be implemented in multiple ways.
Okay. So after this course, you will be providing some what to say, a project kind of thing, right? That we need to work on.
Actually, we itself will create a kind of a framework, automation framework in our course. And yes, if you can work out on your own the same thing, it's well and good. Okay, whatever we are coding we are doing, it's if you can go and do the same thing on your own Eclipse or IntelliJ, it will be really good.
Will we get this recording session?
Yes. So throughout this course, every session is recorded, right? And Rahul will be sharing the recording links in the WhatsApp group or wherever you are in contact with.
Okay, thanks, Ram. Thank you.
Okay, then shall we close the session? Okay, thank you everyone for joining. I hope it was helpful. We'll meet tomorrow.